What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 124. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I'm interviewing Scott Spaulding. He's a return guest to the show and the host of Why I'm Anti-War. He's also a Afghan war vet, which is very interesting because we're talking about the withdrawal from Afghanistan today. Exactly what Biden is doing with that war, how it's changing, what he's going to continue, what's ending, and then also, from his perspective of being a soldier, what it means getting out of Afghanistan, including for all the Afghans who have worked for the U.S. government over the past 2 decades and are now could be left behind. So a lot of interesting stuff on today's show. Be sure to share the show. You'll find it, the video version, on YouTube or Odysee. You can find the show on any of our social media accounts, Facebook, MeWe, or Twitter. The Twitter handle is at @con_interest. You can find the show on the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle, for a full archive of the show and the daily news roundup that I write. You could support the show on Patreon or Subscribestar. And then you could also get yourself some great CBD products and support the show by doing your shopping for CBD at Paloma Verde. The URL is palomaverdecbd.com. Again, palomaverdecbd.com. They have a wide variety of CBD products and infused with different things. They have gummies, soft gels, extracts. They have topicals. I really like their sports cream and has a great menthol smell. Definitely wakes me up in the morning, and it helps relieve pain very quickly, and it lasts for quite a while. So I really recommend the sports cream from there. Whenever you spend $75, you could get 25% off with the promo code PEACE. Again, the promo code PEACE, PEACE, and the URL palomaverdecbd.com. Now let's get into the interview with Scott. Scott, welcome back to the show. How are you doing today?
Doing great, buddy. How you doing?
Doing well. So we are now months into the Afghan withdrawal, which I guess if you had asked me at the start of Biden's presidency, I didn't think we would be this far along with it. So it's quite interesting what's happening there. And I know you follow the news, but also, spend some time in Afghanistan and are a veteran of that war. And so you do have a somewhat unique perspective that you could share with the audience of, kind of your take of what's going on there. I've largely been arguing that I think this war is evolving, not really ending, and I still think that's the case, although it's not, I think, turning out to be as much as maybe a privatized war or something like that as initially I thought. So let's start getting into this. But what are just your initial thoughts about the drawdown? I mean, and then, or maybe we could even start with this because, not that this is the most common argument that you hear now, not like it's like 2008 or something, but that, we're leaving Afghanistan without completing the mission. And so is that an insult to the, people like you who fought this war?
Well, I starting from the beginning, much like you, I just really never thought he was going to follow through with it. I didn't expect him to make an announcement on it. I expected that when he pushed it back, it was just going to be a continual delay. Um, and I'm honestly surprised there's as much progress as there is. As far as, and circle back around to what signs there are that it's really happening. But overall, I mean, I think that the it's not it's a shame that lives were wasted, and not just lives of my friends, and limbs of my friends, but but not just that, but the 10,000 civilians a year that have died over the last 6 years, and thousands more prior to that too,
Right.
and not to mention all the Afghan forces, and it's a shame that all of that has happened, but at this point, I don't think there's anything we're doing to, and I don't think there is anything America can do, frankly, to change the outcome. The amount of, if there were going to be any effort to really let's say, bring what you could call some kind of Pax Romana or whatever, make a desert and call it peace, is what you would have to do there. And we've seen that tried, and we're just lucky to be getting out without the empire collapsing, Soviet Union style. Hopefully, we'll see. But yeah, I think as far as like feelings towards it, I don't know. I personally don't know anyone that is really upset by it at this point. I think we all my friends at least, I mean, the people I'm friends with that haven't been there particularly recently, but they're all sort of just resigned to it being something that's never going to be resolved in a way that they would find satisfactory. And so at what point do you just say, where we can't keep this up forever? I mean, what's the point of propping up one corrupt government full of warlord drug dealers and child rapists over another? What favor is it incurring us to hold up this Kabul government? I don't see any. So, yeah. So as far as feelings go, it's just overall, it's time to take the Band-Aid off. There's going to be some ugliness, I suspect, and certainly it's going to be played up to a certain narrative that we can never withdraw. America can never withdraw from anywhere ever, or else bad things happen. There's probably not going to be all sunshine and rainbows in Afghanistan. It probably never will be. But that's not any reason to continue what we've been doing. So, yeah, it's just a kind of ambivalent, like, well, it's about time, frankly.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the whole it's not going to be sunshine and rainbows is a great point to make. Well, it just, look at the U.S. and the inner cities here and stuff like that. It would hard to say, it's sunshine and rainbows here. But, I mean, even looking at, like, south of the border in Mexico, where, like, the amount of homicides there is absolutely off the charts insane. Why is it a standard that there has to be some low level of violence in the country for the American military to leave? It's just, that's kind of, I think, one of the false narratives that's always put in front of us, that it has to be like a great, good, or better situation before we leave. And
Yeah.
it's not going to happen here.
I mean, like, if the remit of the American government is to ensure that no one on the planet is tyrannized ever anywhere by another person, then you've got a lot of work ahead of you.
Right.
I mean, you gotta decide, like, if that's what people seem to at least take at face value. It's sort of absurd, but they'll take this. Well, bad things might happen to women or to the interpreters or to this or that group of people that we are sympathetic towards, and rightfully so. Doesn't mean that that the answer to that question, our regret that bad things might happen to people, is that we need armed people around the planet and air support dropping bombs to try to prevent that. And when you take it to some conclusion where we're going to need a troop in every bedroom to make sure that nothing bad ever happens in every bedroom, then you get to a point of absurdity, and who's going to watch the watchers. But some people really just seem to think that would be an okay situation. It's or at least they don't take it to that conclusion. They just can't economize. I always think of it as, it's a central planner's problem, where they can't, all of the allocation is going to be political. How are we going to allocate these resources? There's no way we could possibly meet the demand, but we're going to allocate them politically to maximize our own personal benefit.
Right.
Or,
So, let's get into some of the logistics, or what's happening with this withdrawal and what this warfare is going to look like. I guess the main thing is we've the AFCOM commander, General Townsend, has said that they're commuting to work in Afghanistan, or in Somalia now. And so my initial thought was, well, what Biden's going to do is he'll probably leave contractors in and then pull out most U.S. forces, deploy like a bunch of special forces in the region, and just have them commute to work. However, I don't know how well that's going to work, because then you have to have somebody willing to give you a base in the region to operate out of. And so I know you have a lot of stuff on that, so let's start there and just kind of what do you think's going on, and will the U.S. get like some kind of base in a bordering country? And I do got a map up here so people could look at what the countries bordering Afghanistan are here: Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan from the north, the old Soviet republics, and then of course Iran and Pakistan, and a small border with China.
Yeah, let's try for Iran maybe. Just no the so I do happen to know like I said, I was skeptical that there was going to be any real drawdown at all. I thought it was going to be a numbers game, and let's hire more contractors and fewer in uniform and have more but signs seem to point towards they really are going to zero out theoretically the number of defense contractors. And I happen to know that an A-10 unit was canceled, and their replacement unit is it's up in the air whether that unit going to Afghanistan is going to happen at all, or it's going to be diverted somewhere. Different fighter aircraft that have a little bit more speed and range have been diverted to other countries. I don't know where. Um, they're still, I think, in support of operating in Afghanistan, but they're, like you said, having a little bit longer commute. Um, from what I've seen, negotiations to rebase nearby are not going very well. Pakistan has basically said absolutely not unless they get like ministerial level approval of every single when we were conducting airstrikes in secret from Pakistan that blew up in the Pakistani government's face, and they don't want that to happen again. Um, and there's been attempts to negotiate with countries to the north. Originally, at the very beginning of the war, I believe it was back. I know that the base was called K2, Kanishan Korabat. It was Tajikistan, I think. Um, do you happen to know where K2 was?
I think it was Uzbekistan, but I'm not
Uzbekistan.
positive. I could be wrong on that, but it was one of the former Soviet republics, and
Yeah. So
I do believe they had like a whole bunch of like chemical weapons or something stored there at one time, and there's just tons of health issues
yeah,
from the for the soldiers that were stationed there.
yeah, it was like a hazardous waste site basically, and they couldn't. Like it was not tenable. I've never heard anything good about being there. To have a air base there. So then they ended up moving, and I went through here on both of my deployments to Kyrgyzstan, which is not neighboring, but is close enough by as a what they called a transit center. But that was also very touchy. I don't think any combat aircraft operated out of there. It was just refueling aircraft, and I remember wasn't far down the road there was a Soviet air base on like just the opposite side of the capital city there. So we were on one side of the capital city, and the Soviets have had a permanent presence. Or Soviets, what am I talking about? Russians have had a permanent presence there, and that was really touchy as well. So I don't think those are avenues that they're going to be able to open up, and but they've tried. They've sent Khalilzad, I think it was his name, Khalilzad,
Yeah,
to Uzbekistan and Tajikistan to negotiate, and it doesn't seem like it's come to fruition. They've sought. Oh, here it is. Uzbekistan is where K2 was. You're right. And that looks like it's possible that they're considering that, or Tajikistan. There apparently still is a base that the Germans use, which a NATO out, which is possibly something they're going. So I wouldn't put it past them to try to continue to keep some kind of deployment presence in a neighboring country. It's not exactly feasible, I don't think, for them to keep a carrier in that task just for that. And that obviously puts a lot more strain. I mean, the more miles they have to cover, the more maintenance they have to do, and it kind of exponentially stacks up. So the further away they are, the harder it gets for them to conduct things or surge support if in the event of some kind of emergency, which we also saw. And I'm sorry I didn't include links for this. Was there's this conflicting information and this kind of about whether or not we will intervene, or to what extent we would conduct airstrikes in Afghanistan if the Kabul government was collapsing. You know, um, for a while they said there was some information out that they um, that they were at least threatening to, conduct massive retaliation if there were a threat to the Kabul government. But now, Voice of America, as of like today, which Voice of America, but the only reason we would conduct airstrikes after we depart would be if we uncover an attack on the homeland of the United States. So I don't know. It's really, I hate to give credit, but it looks like either, all of our options have been played out and we recognize that there's nothing left to do, or it's one way to look at it, or it looks like we might actually be getting out because it's the right thing to do and about time. So um, it seems like all the options have exhausted. It's not for lack of trying. I don't think that they've been looking for options um, to stay and keep air power close by, but I think they've seemed to have given up on that mostly. And there's just some lingering questions about, who's going to maintain security at the Kabul airport, apparently, because Turkey's been doing that, which is interesting. Just thinking about Turkish heroin connections.
Hmm.
Sorry, that's just random, but
Yeah.
um,
Well, I did want to jump in and kind of highlight there that yeah, like who knows what the Biden original plan was, but at this point, and the Taliban have made threats to other countries in the region saying don't allow the Americans to operate out of your country. And as you point out, you could carry out operations with an aircraft carrier, but I'm guessing you can't deploy massive number of troops with one, but if you want to launch like an F-15 or an F-18 off one and go and bomb something in Afghanistan, I'm sure that wouldn't be very difficult. And as
mm,
you point out, like the past tensions with Pakistan kind of made that not a great option either. And I think they look for some kind of approval on the strikes. And so, yeah, it seems like if the U.S. is leaving, then the mission there is going to have to be pretty limited going forward. Now,
mm,
I guess my hesitancy and skepticism, and I guess the reason I think that people need to keep up pressure is right now we're talking about what's theoretically going to happen when the Afghan army can't maintain their air force, and they can't use their helicopters in the missions against the Taliban, and then Lashkar or Kandahar city are about to fall to the Taliban. Then then if Biden doesn't go forward with airstrikes in support of the Afghan government, then if he doesn't apply new troops or figure out some way to help repair the asset, the maintenance on the aircraft and stuff. Although I have heard that they're looking at maintaining the aircraft outside of the country, which they said something about Qatar. That seems like a long way away to me to be transporting aircraft to maintain it, but yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. That just, right now it looks good, but when the time comes, what the Biden administration actually decides to do, especially if he's running for re-election or Kamala's running for election, and it's going to be a dark mark, or the Republicans will use it as something against him if things are going poorly in Afghanistan.
so yeah, it's interesting the political calculation where they're going to want to try to hold it together at least through the midterms. I imagine, if not for another 3 years, because they're not going to want that imagery of Kabul falling on their administration for sure. You know, so I wonder, and that would obviously, and that would be bad for our ends because it would only encourage like more hawkishness on the part of like the opposition party, whoever that is, will be blaming the other one and calling for more and more. So that's something to be concerned about on our end. That really we want them to hold it together. And I can't cite who it was right now, but there was a discussion I was listening to recently about the last time Afghanistan fell after the Soviet withdrawal. And really, it was a surprise to me. I didn't know that and that's my own, all right, that the Soviet supported government held on. The withdrawal was 1989, but the government didn't collapse until 92, 93 ish. Because they held on for about 3 years until they stopped getting funding, basically. So the withdrawal, it wasn't that the opposition was strong enough to take the entire country or didn't even bother until the financial support for the Kabul government at the time stopped. So I imagine that likewise, as long as we're keeping the cash flowing um, to the right people and the repairs are being done, and we're, those sorts of things might keep that afloat for long enough, possibly.
Hmm.
That's just, I mean, that's, one example is not, proof that it will work that way in the future. But I think it's imaginable that they would have all the incentives in the world to try to pour all the resources they can in to keep the status quo for as long, at least through the midterms, if not through the presidential election, the next presidential election. Um, so, uh, yeah, that leaves, I think it's inevitable that there's going to be either some kind of negotiated settlement or some kind of, or, the Taliban's going to control everything but a few major cities, and I don't see how that works out in the long term, except sort of an uneasy truce. It's not as though, as far as I understand, the ANA, the Afghan National Army, hasn't made some kind of turn or major, massive improvements in motivation and quality of forces in the last 10 years. So I don't suspect that's going to suddenly happen. I think they're gonna drop their guns and walk away as soon as their paycheck, as soon as their lives are at risk, frankly, let alone their paychecks.
Right.
Um, so it's hard to know. But we do have that. This, one of the things that's related to that is, and there was a lot of pearl clutching and concern about what will happen to our various collaborators if, in the event of some kind of offensive against the government we've supported. So many headlines. It was like as if everyone got the signal. Just like, you remember the Kurds. Everyone's screaming about the Kurds when we were going to withdraw from Syria. Everyone's screaming about not even to mention that the Kurds were under attack by our allies, the Turks. So it's just not even mention that. Just everyone screaming about the Kurds are in danger. Everyone's screaming about the interpreters and the women. And there are some strange events that have happened too, because there was the bombing at that girls' school, and there was a killing of some demining workers, which just seemed a
And
little
polio
aggressive.
vaccination workers.
Yeah. Some recent kind of uh, attacks that at least a little bit, it made me, especially because I don't think the Taliban claimed most of them. I think with the demining workers, I think they did not claim it at all.
Same
And
with
I
the
don't think they're,
polio workers.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, that just makes me afraid that it's one of these, the what's it, the task force, Afghan task force going rogue or something, trying to create the incentives for us to stay put. Now that's purely speculative, but I I honestly think it's, the Taliban has all the cards in their favor right now. The only thing they'd be screwing themselves by getting squirrely before we are completely out. I mean, what benefits is it to them? It's a cui bono question. Like, it makes more sense for somebody that is allied to us or depends on our continuing presence there to do some of these things. And knowing what we know about them, it's not as though they're saints. So
Right.
just something in the back of my mind. And then you just this fervor about, like, what are we going to do? Like, at what point, what are we going to do about the interpreters, and what are we going to do about the Kabul government if they're in trouble? And the Taliban has pledged not to retaliate against them. But at what point are we ever going to learn that this is part of war? That we need to decide before we go to war that there are going to be people there on our side that we're going to feel, that are going to risk their lives, the lives of their families, their entire livelihood, like everything, to support our cause. We're going to incentivize them. We're going to dump money on them. We're going to invite people to be interpreters for us, to work in the government as functionaries, to work for NGOs as interpreters, but on our behalf. And at what point are we going to, before, the big thing is, I mean, I'm vehemently anti-war, but I would be a lot more comfortable if, for once, we had a mature conversation before going into it. Hey, look, and it's so easy to forget. Like, hey, look, if we go to Afghanistan, there's going to be tens of thousands. We're going to create thousands, if not tens of thousands, of people. that will depend on us, just like we did with Iraqi interpreters, just like we did with the Kurds and the Hmong and you name it. You're going to ask a bunch of people in a country very remote from us to put everything, more than we would ever risk as Americans, more than any soldier risks. You know, none of our families are in danger when we're deployed. You
Right.
know what I mean? But these people, their entire family is at risk, and they put that on the line for our cause, and we ask them to do it, and then we never think about, well, what'll happen to them if they we just it's just this American, I don't want to call it exceptionalism, but this American like just thoughtlessness about like, well, we've got to save the Afghans, but like not even considering what would happen to them if and when, you know, our effort fails, you know,
Right.
or in the process of succeeding, just demand so much more of the people in those countries and don't even think about them at all, which is, you could call it exceptionalism, or you could just call it thoughtless carelessness. Like, we're not even going to think about what's really going to happen. We're going to send this vague sympathy of, well, we want good things for those people and no bad things to happen, but we're not even going to think about what that entails, you know?
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and I would assume there's like a lot of the, maybe not construction, but like some of the work done on these bases, like maintenance, or I know there's like sanitation work or like fast food places on some of these. I don't know if that's
Hmm.
particular with the Bagram Air Base or the Kandahar Airfield, but I assume that they're not bringing Americans or and soldiers over to the McDonald's at Bagram Air Base to like, and that they're, and that maybe the, you know, Afghans who work at those places, like they're not really doing anything to support the mission, but that doesn't mean that there's not like misinterpretations then from people who would like want to seek retaliation. So I would guess like just the number of jobs like of like on American you know, bases, embassies, consulates are probably huge for Afghans. And like, you know, we're talking about just a lot of people, and probably a lot more Afghans than even like the Democrats will be comfortable bringing to the U.S. And yeah, just if people are willing to have that conversation before war, that we're gonna screw a lot of Afghan people with this, and we're gonna open them up to retaliation. That's not a conversation. So go
Yeah.
ahead.
I mean, well, you know, you bring up a few. So one thing, a lot of those, the overwhelming majority of workers in those countries, like on a base, are going to be what we convert to TCN, third country nationals. It's going to be somebody from Philippines or Pakistan or Nepal. A lot of all of that goes through Halliburton and KBR, who have sort of a network of hiring processes to bring in people because they don't, they could be trusted more, frankly. So it's only a handful of jobs, like waste removal, on smaller bases. We would have a guy like, you know, suck out the septic tank on the base, and dump it out in the desert somewhere, or interpreters. There's only going to be a handful of services that really are going to be sourced from locals. But even then, those people, and then civil affairs wise, because that's what I was doing, all the contractors we hired to do things like um, build, you know, little projects that I would do, rebuild the government center kind of stuff. They did put their lives at risk. I mean, in Iraq, the contractors that worked with us were murdered, you know, not long after we left, because they worked on our behalf to do just these, you know, almost entirely like reconstruction projects, like rebuilding a water treatment plant. But it didn't matter. They collaborated. They got murdered, you know. So these
I
people
think
take
the
a,
construction crews building the highways have also been targeted quite a bit.
yeah, yeah. Um, so yeah, that's something we think, like those of us on the ground who work with them think about, but even then, like we go home in 7 months or a year and never think and rarely think about those people again. I mean, I think I wonder sometimes about the people I worked with and whether they're safe, but I think most people don't think twice about it.
Yeah.
And then yeah, so
I
as
mean, I
far
think that's so let's talk about this a little bit more, especially from like the anti-war perspective, because this is typically used as a talking point from the Hawks as a reason we can't leave, right? We
mhm,
can never leave because we have to like stay to make sure the people who helped us are, you know, like they basically set it up as, you know, another reason to stay forever. But you know, here you are, an anti-war guy, saying that this is something really important that we need to talk about, and so
mhm.
what exactly is the solution here? Because as I said, and as you're pointing out, there's a lot of people that we're talking about, because not only are
Mm,
we talking about these people, but we're talking about their family and maybe somewhat extended family, like
mm.
grandparents, brothers. I don't, I mean, maybe not your
Yeah.
third cousin, but your cousin that lives with you. Maybe his life is at risk too. So, like,
Well, well, it,
what's the solution here?
well, it brings us actually. There's a concept that I don't hear spoken about enough that really kind of encapsulates it. I refer to it as the harvest of empire, and you can see it whether you go to England and their and where and the immigrant populations they have there, or to France and the immigrant populations they have there, or the United States, the different waves of Korean and Vietnamese immigrants we've had, and Iraqi immigrants. Everywhere you go to war, you create these pathways for people to have a relationship with your country. You know what I mean? Whether it starts with special immigration visas for interpreters, and then their extended families, and so to some extent, like there's this, from the sort of conservative, closed borders, control immigration perspective, it doesn't make any sense to me to be a hawk, because you have to acknowledge that, I mean, just look back at history. All of our major a lot of our major waves of immigration, especially since we really turned towards imperialism in the turn of the century, you know, all of those waves of immigration, whether it's Puerto Ricans or whatever, are the harvest of our empire. Wherever we go off on military adventures, we end up creating pathways for people to come here, and for reasons, we develop sympathies with them. We ask them to to do things on our behalf, and then if things go our way, then we've created this relationship with the country, and it's reciprocal, and you have more Puerto Ricans in New York City than you have in Puerto Rico. You know what I mean? Or whether it doesn't go well and the country collapses, the government we've created collapses, and you have boat people trying to escape Vietnam, desperately trying to make their way to somewhere where they won't be persecuted for having been on our side for decades. Um, so you have to recognize that when you go to war, these are things that are going to happen. It is part of the package. Um, and I think you'll find a lot of people have less taste for it when they do. And related to something you mentioned earlier, as far like what's interesting, for a long time, we have a process in place for training pilots, especially pilots, because they have to be trained on our aircraft and they have to really have a good command of the English language. Um, so when Saudi, all of the different, you name a government we've allied ourselves to, they come to the United States and they have to pass an English exam, and they get sometimes up to a year of English instruction at a place called the English Language Institute in Lackland Air Force Base, Texas, where they sit and they're paid, often, through a roundabout way of we give money to their country and their country gives the money right back to us. And then we pay their officers and enlisted sometimes to get trained up on English and then go to their technical schools, their training on the aircraft or their jet engine repair. They go up to the Air Force Training Center just north of there in Wichita Falls, and they learn how to build bombs or repair jet engines, or they go to Pensacola and shoot up a classroom full of Navy pilots because they get a lewd nickname. You know what I mean? All of those things are these. But what's interesting about that particular, so they have this infrastructure already. Well, Afghans were being brought in droves, and deserting as soon as they got to the United States and driving to Canada, where Canada offered blanket asylum to anyone who was from Afghanistan. So we would bring over at quite a cost Afghan officers, and when they felt like they had the chance, they would escape to Canada. Um, and so they had to then recreate all of this in Jordan. They had to recreate all the training, move all kinds of stuff over to Jordan, because the problem of having all of these people that Afghan officers were recruited and started training at a good deal of expense, so many of them were just like, screw this, we're out of here. And that we had to put it in Jordan, where they wouldn't be able to escape or get asylum from the Jordanian government. So, yeah, from an anti-war perspective, frankly, the solution to me is, well, let's cut out the middleman, skip the war, and if you have sympathies to this is just me talking, but um, I'm an open borders libertarian anarchist, and let's just skip the middleman. And if you feel bad for people in another country, let them come here. You know what I mean? If there's a crummy situation, rather than spend money on the war, all the killing, all that crap. If you feel bad for the situation somebody's in another part of the planet, just let them come here for Pete's sake. Wouldn't that be like everyone would be happier with that situation? And the people that want to yes, there will be a small proportion of people who, for whatever reason, can't leave the crummy situation they're in. You know what I mean? But going to war, there's not going to make it any better for them either, because they're not going to get it's not going to improve the situation any more than just saying, you know what, there's a crummy. That's what asylum exists for. If we had a more liberal, even if you don't want to go to the full open borders position, why don't we consider granting asylum to the Jews that are in Germany and Poland rather than ending up going to war and using it as opposed to, you know what I mean? The xenophobe, and that's when you try to offer that as a solution, you'll just instantly get this xenophobic response. And it's like, you don't even recognize that you're going to get this anyways.
Right.
You know?
Well, and it's so interesting now too, especially it's like essentially like a self-fulfilling prophecy for the Republicans, right? That, the reason that we have to have like these strict border and immigration laws is because of terrorism, that terrorism's going to come through. But it's the very wars creating the refugees and the anti-American hatred with it. So here's the, like, if there's a bad situation in Syria, I would feel far more comfortable with boats of Syrians coming to the U.S. if the U.S. also wasn't still bombing Syria, because I don't want some dude whose, cousin and his whole family are like sitting in their house, and because somebody thought some ISIS guy was in there, they dropped a bomb and they killed them all. And this guy saw horrific pictures of what happened to his, little niece who he loved more than anything in the world, and then goes and does something. Well, I mean, all we had to do is not be dropping bombs, and it takes away a lot of the whole, risk of what terrorism could happen. And
you're so right. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't have put it better, but I'm going to try anyways. That you're exactly right. That there people will have that poison pill analogy. Well, you can't let in all these refugees because if one of these Skittles was poisoned, you wouldn't need any of them. You know what I mean? And it's absurd on its face, because what you're really doing by fighting over there is you're still creating this refugee situation where they're going to escape the circumstance they're in, and anyone with half a heart is going, and you're going to end up in these negotiations where Turkey or the neighboring country says, well, you've got to take some of these people, you caused this situation. You're going to end up with that. And then on top of it, you're going to end up now that you've started bombing, you're going to end up having to sort out wheat from chaff as far as, is there any, and you're making it worse at every step. You're increasing the likelihood that someone has been traumatized by us, and then has the avenue to escape to our country and perhaps retaliate. But if you just were magnanimous and open your doors and were, I'm not going to quote Lazarus, the Statue of Liberty speech, but if you just were a refuge for people, you would inspire nothing but good feelings. You know what I mean? Nobody's going to be mad at the people in the world who open their doors to people who are, it's just not going to happen. If we were a sanctuary for people in danger rather than simultaneously offering sanctuary and going off causing these disasters,
Right.
It's absurd.
And I mean, again, so much of the refugee crisis that we already have to, deal with is because, you look at what happened in Libya, it was after that we took out Gaddafi that there's a huge amount of people trying to flood into Europe, right? Like, it wasn't an issue before, it is now. Or Syria, there's 2 million Syrians living in Turkey who've been living in pretty horrible conditions this whole time. How many of them, you go back to the Iraq War, Syria wouldn't have been chaotic if it wasn't for the Iraq War. that situation wouldn't have happened. Even if you leave out the Timber Sycamore program and everything like our intervention breeds chaos, which breeds the number of refugees. But I think even if you don't want to like put out the idea that America's a sanctuary, the very fact that you're not waging the wars and that if people do happen to come to America, you let them in. You don't have to be like, hey, everybody come here. You just be like, if you make it here, we're in like send you through a little screening and then you're good. Then that's that, right? Like, then there's not this like hatred towards America and everything, and not as many refugees overall, anyways. But
Yeah, even if you weren't going to go to the extremes that I'd be willing to, like, it's just, I challenge your sympathies. I question your real motivations if you say, well, we have to go to war to help these people, but just letting them into your home to help them, hypothetically, into your country to help them is not an option. I really question whether, whether that's a good tell for whether someone really has humanitarian motivations. Well, if you could, would you let them come live here in safety? And if their answer is no, then they're full of it. And they don't really care about the safety and security of those people. They want war for some other reason,
right.
you know?
Yeah. So one thing that we kind of lost track of that I want to bring back up that you talked about in there that I think is really important was that the Afghan government after the Soviets left was able to maintain because of the financial support, and I do think the U.S. government, and we've already seen that this year they're actually uptaking the amount of financial support they're giving, or at least that's the plan in the Pentagon budget is to I think be at 3.3 billion in military assistance for Afghanistan. Then who knows how much else in humanitarian assistance and where all of that money's going anyways. But we can throw a lot of money at that problem, and I guess in one sense I worry that it'll just exacerbate the corruption situation. The less Americans there are on the ground in Afghanistan, I assume it's that much easier to do corrupt things with that money. At the same time, if you throw more money at them, even if it is going to more and more corrupt places, I mean, maybe they don't need that much money to actually maintain a situation where they could bribe and then fight off the Taliban enough to be relative. Not that there's not going to be fighting in some areas of Afghanistan in 2 years, but that they're going to be able to, make sure that the Taliban aren't anywhere near Kabul or like taking Ghazni or anything like that.
Well, and you mentioned that, and I don't know where this has progressed, but there was a bit of a to do about a road contractor that was paying off the Taliban, and in this question, and then I think they were being sued by somebody who was killed by the Taliban, claiming that this road contractor basically was funding the Taliban, you know and it brings to light, like, this was going on under our nose the whole time. This was going on perhaps knowingly, like, to some extent. Like, even the little ricky-dig contractors that I hired for a few $1,000s to do little hodgepodge nothing projects, I knew that I knew that some proportion of the money they were getting was going to pay off so that they could do the job, you know what I mean, without being harassed.
Right.
And that's just at the low level. The bigger the pot gets, the higher up you go. I'm sure that, I imagine we would be shocked. I wouldn't be shocked if half of the money we've spent in Afghanistan has ended up in the hands of the Taliban. I would not be even remotely shocked if half of all of the money we spent, what is it, 2 trillion or so? I would not be shocked if about 1 trillion of it has ended up in the hands of the Taliban through these roundabout channels of, it's better just to pay. And so I do wonder if, to some extent, that's as long as we're dumping money on the situation, then the Afghan government can bribe the Taliban to leave them alone. And actually, strangely, the less oversight we have over that, the perhaps easier it will be for them to grease the right palms and just keep their power. You know what I mean?
Right.
The less they'll have to. But I mean, that's all speculative. I think the other thing that was interesting was not to go too far into it, but this is a holdover. I saw this when I was looking at, this concern about civilians and just the aspect of them removing this And apparently, it was a policy implemented like 2 years ago. Exactly. Yeah, that there's this um, process they have where they start to try to figure out how, before we conduct an airstrike, how dangerous, how, what's the risk, just not even, not based off of other factors, but just how built up is the area, not do we see any civilians, but just based off of a calculation. And they did away with that. And the news article just kind of came out to this week about how it doesn't seem to be like Biden's planning on bringing it back, you know. Like you said, we've gotten a Biden president. It's just another continuation of the Trump presidency. So many of Trump's policies are just being continued. So apparently, had some role in controlling the civilian casualties. Now, if you look at the civilian casualties in Syria, which I don't remember them significantly dropping off after 2018, relative to the number of bombs dropped, at least. But they had this, or like I don't remember when they dropped this policy that the number of, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, they spiked. In Afghanistan, the number of bombings spiked, but the number of civilian casualties per bombing went way up after 2018. Um, so to some extent, you could argue that this policy had an effect of protecting civilians, and there's no interest in renewing it, apparently. Where they, before every bombing, they had to look at, well, how densely populated is the area, what kinds of buildings are there, et cetera, et cetera. You know.
Right. Yeah, this is the whole we got to take the gloves off the military so they could do their job idea. And that's why, the U.S. hasn't been more successful in some of these interventions. Scott, let's talk a little bit about what's happening in Europe. I know you had some notes here.
Yeah.
And Biden and Putin, I think, just had their meeting as we're recording. I saw only
Mhm.
a few of the things, but the expectations going into this thing were pretty low, and
Yeah.
rightfully so. So, I mean, I guess the only positive thing that I was able to, and again, I haven't done like a deep dive, maybe they
Hmm.
got into something bigger, but other than them reaffirming what Gorbachev and Reagan said during the 1980s, that the very obvious statement, there's no winner of a nuclear war, nothing positive came out of this. So why were expectations so low going in?
Well, I mean, Biden obviously, like, of all the things, he came out saying things he didn't need to say about Putin from the get-go, calling him a killer, being unnecessary. Like the Democrat, particularly hawkishness towards Russia, has been a cause of concern for mine for a few years now. I mean, I remember in 2016 being sure that if Hillary won, we were like, there were these massive buildups, and they're still building up the drums towards conflict with Russia, and you could hear it. I mean, obviously, it shouldn't go unsaid that expectations for Biden generally should be pretty low, but he really didn't set up for a good situation meeting with Putin. And then what's funny is to hear the media framing it, even going into it, that it was the same stuff you hear when they talked about Trump, like he's legitimizing Kim Jong Un by meeting with him, kind of nonsense. And it's like, do you really think they give rats behind whether? I don't think they care whether we're legitimizing them by meeting them. That's not really a thing. But that was all the media framing. The Economist said, well, Putin's got a huge win just by being seen by by just by getting a meeting with Biden, and he doesn't really even deserve this kind of nonsense coming out of like what are supposed to be thoughtful liberal media outlets like The Economist. And they did speculate that there wasn't probably going to be any progress on any major points of contention. They suspected that there might be some work on the Iran issue and on Afghanistan, because because those are kind of areas of mutual interest. But even that seems like it hasn't progressed, and instead there's just this. I mean, I don't hear in the declaration there's no winners in a nuclear war leading to renewing the Open Skies Treaty, which was universally agreed to be one of the better, easier to comply with programs. And instead we're getting some puff statement and nothing. It just and meantime you have this nonsense about the Russia conducting the largest military exercises since the Cold War, which, from everything I could gather, was like 2 ships, and not even armed ships. We're not talking about, you know, one of them looked like a research vessel with a helicopter, and and they said, and they have to list out research, two, multiple ships, not just two, because there's only a picture of two, multiple ships and anti-submarine warfare aircraft. It's like, by anti-submarine warfare aircraft, you're talking about the helicopter that's just part of the ship's complement that's always there. But you're going to make it sound like, but you got to make this long as possible to make it sound like this is more sinister than it is. That they've conducted this within 300 to 500 miles of the outside area of Hawaii. They've come. Oh God,
Right.
So close that even the patrol aircraft didn't go out to meet them. I mean, we have these incursions every day practically where one of our aircraft is right on the Soviet-Russian border. This wasn't even close enough for them to actually send an aircraft to touch base with.
Right. And meanwhile, the U.S. is sailing the entire USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier strike group through the South China Sea. So,
Yeah.
one's going to draw, head page, headline news that, oh, we had to worry about this, we had to confront that. And then the other one is just like, hey, cool, check out all of our ships in this neat looking formation out in the middle of this big blue ocean. We're not going to actually point to it on a map or explain, all the armaments on these ships and how they could, be used offensively against China. But, just look at this cool picture and know that we're doing good stuff with our military. It's absolutely absurd. I don't know if I guess we were talking before. You haven't been on Twitter all day, so what people have been doing, the Western reporters have been doing with their time in Geneva, is yelling questions at Vladimir Putin about why is he such a thug? Why do so many of your political opponents go missing, and stuff like that. I haven't really seen any constructive questions directed at either of them. There wasn't a joint presser like you had at the Oslo or Helsinki meeting with Trump and Putin, and even there, they, Sam Husseini tried to ask a question about nuclear weapons, and they pulled his ass right out of that conference. So,
I think that anybody asking a question of like Putin's such a cool customer, I think they would probably get embarrassed if they tried to ask him something. If they got in a room with him and try, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The few interviews, like he's good with his words,
Mm-hmm.
and he like, and meanwhile you have Biden. I mean, it couldn't be more stark, and it's not like Putin's a spring chicken either,
Right.
And still just to see the like, I can't imagine what that meeting was like.
Yeah, I did see that one of the pictures had Biden, and I think to his right was Jake Sullivan, and his left was Victoria Nuland. And I mean, this is about the equivalent to Trump bringing John Bolton to Singapore. Yeah, that was Singapore, I think, or Hanoi. Hanoi was the second one.
Hanoi.
Yeah, so this is I don't know. From what I've seen so far, it's not encouraging. I think Putin said afterwards that the conditions aren't right for a meeting either in Moscow or Kiev. So not Kiev,
Kiev.
right, or in DC. So I don't know. A lot of interesting things going on. I'm sure that relationship will continue to develop. But Scott, any final thoughts on what's happening in Europe before we wrap up here? If not, tell people where they can find your work.
No, nothing really. I like I said, I'm looking forward to the outcome of all this, and I imagine the sycophantic praise of Biden's, stellar performance just by not doing anything too embarrassing on his first little trip abroad, you know. But I don't expect there to be any major breakthroughs. I'd be pleasantly surprised if we got something good out of it. But yeah, no, I just hopefully, at least on Afghanistan, he's following through on his word. And, the only problem there is, his word on Russia and China is not so good. So I think they really are building towards, out of the frying pan and into the fire is something I'm a little bit afraid of here. But hopefully that'll be a conversation for the next time.
Right. Well, I'll definitely
Yeah.
have you back on the show again, but everybody needs to check out your show. I got the sticker right here, the
Yep.
Why I'm Anti-War podcast. You've done a bunch of great episodes now, including,
Mm.
I think, Scott Horton's shortest ever interview. So that's
I don't know
absolutely
what that says about me
fantastic.
as an interviewer, but now he kept it
Uh,
tight. I like
yeah.
his was great. So yeah, the podcast is Why I'm Anti-War. You can find it at Anti-War Podcast. I will have new episodes soon. I'm sorry, I was in a bit of a hiatus because you can't see right now, but I'm in the we just moved and it's been a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole idea is anyone's anti-war story, whether you don't have to be a veteran, you could be anyone. You watched you know uh, a Stanley Kubrick movie once and decided you hate war is good enough for me to have you come on. And Scott Horton, it was George Carlin, jamming in New York. So whatever it is, there be hopefully someday I'll have 1,000 different reasons to be anti-war from 1,000 different perspectives. I have Garrett Reppenhagen and Adam Kokesh in the can to
Awesome.
put out, and a few other great ones too that'll be coming out shortly. I've got them recorded. I just need to do the editing thing, and you'll see those in your feed soon.
All right. And at MD Vet 4, and then the name is MD Vet 4 Peace on Twitter. So be sure to follow that account. You're pretty active
Yep,
there. You do a
that'll
lot of
be the
stuff.
spicy one.
Yep. All right. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks. Take care.